It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 14. I joined the Christian, or some call it the Campbellite Church, as a mere boy, not yet dry behind the ears. But I wish then and I wish now that it were possible for me to belong to the whole glorious brotherhood, to be one in communion at the same time with the brave Presbyterians that fight the pusillanimous, mendacious, destructive, tomfool higher critics, so-called, and with the Methodists who so strongly oppose war, yet in wartime can always be counted upon for patriotism to the limit, and with the splendidly tolerant Baptists, the Seventh-day Adventists, and I guess I could even say a kind word for the Unitarians, as that great executive William Howard Taft belonged to them, also his wife. From 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. Officially, Doremus belonged to the Universalist Church, his wife and children to the Episcopal, a natural American transition. He had been reared to admire Hosea Ballou, the Universalist St. Augustine, who, from his tiny parsonage in Bernard, Vermont, had proclaimed his faith that even the wickedest would have, after earthly death, another chance of salvation. But now Doremus could scarce enter the Fort Beulah Universalist Church. It had too many memories of his father, the pastor, and it was depressing to see how the old-time congregations, in which 200 thick beards would wag in the grained pine benches every Sunday morning, and their womenfolks and children line up beside the patriarchs, had dwindled to aged widows and farmers and a few school teachers. But in this time of seeking, Doremus did venture there. The church was a squat and gloomy building of granite, not particularly enlivened by the arches of colored slate above the windows, yet as a boy Doremus had thought it and its sawed-off tower the Superior Chartres. He had loved it as in Isaiah College he had loved the library, which, for all its appearances of being a crouching red-brick toad, had meant to him freedom for spiritual discovery, still cavern of a reading room where for hours one could forget the world and never be nagged away to supper. He found on this one attendance at the Universalist Church a scattering of 30 disciples, being addressed by a supply, a theological student from Boston, monotonously shouting his well-meant, frightened, and slightly plagiaristic eloquence in regard to the sickness of Abijah, the son of Jeroboam. Doremus looked at the church walls, painted a hard and glistening green, unornamented, to avoid all the sinful trappings of papistry, while he listened to the preacher's hesitant droning. Now what so many of us fail to realize is how any sin that we ourselves may commit, any sin reflects not on ourselves, but on those that we hold dear and near. He would have given anything, Doremus yearned, for a sermon which, however irrational, would passionately lift him to renewed courage, which would bathe him in consolation these beleaguered months. But with a shock of anger, he saw that that was exactly what he had been condemning just a few days ago. The irrational, dramatic power of the crusading leader, clerical or political. Very well, then, sadly. He'd just have to get along without the spiritual consolation of the church that he had known in college days. No, first he'd try the ritual of his friend Mr. Falk, the padre, Buck Titus sometimes called him. In the cozy Anglicanism of St. Crispin's P.E. Church, with its imitation English memorial brasses and imitation Celtic front and brass eagle reading desk and dusky-smelling maroon carpet, Doremus listened to Mr. Falk. Almighty God, the Father of our Lord Jesus, who desireth not the death of a sinner, but rather that he may turn from his wickedness and live, and hath given power and commandment to his ministers to declare and pronounce to his people, being penitent, the absolution and remission of their sins. Doremus glanced at the placidly pious facade of his wife Emma. The lovely, familiar old ritual seemed meaningless to him now, with no more pertinence to a life menaced by Buzzed Windrip and his Minutemen, no more comfort for having lost his old deep pride in being an American, than a stage revival of an equally lovely and familiar Elizabethan play. He looked about nervously. However exalted Mr. Falk himself might be, most of the congregation were Yorkshire pudding. The Anglican Church was, to them, not the aspiring humility of Newman or the humanity of Bishop Brown, both of whom left it, but the sign and proof of prosperity, an ecclesiastical version of owning a 12-cylinder Cadillac, or even more of knowing that one's grandfather owned his own Surrey and a respectable old family horse. The whole place smelled to Doremus of stale muffins. Mrs. R.C. Crowley was wearing white gloves, and on her bust, for a Mrs. Crowley, even in 1936, did not yet have breasts, was a tight bouquet of tuberoses. Francis Tasbro had a morning coat and striped trousers, and on the lilac-colored pew cushion beside him was, unique in Fort Bueller, a silk top hat. And even the wife of Doremus's bosom, or at least of his breakfast coffee, the good Emma, had a pedantic expression of superior goodness which irritated him. "Whole outfit stifles me," he snapped. "Rather be at a yelling, jumping, holy roller orgy. No, that's Buzz Windrip's kind of jungle hysterics. I want a church, if there can be one, possibly, that's advanced beyond the jungle and beyond the chaplains of King Henry VIII. I know why, even though she's painfully conscientious, Lorinda never goes to church." Lorinda Pike, on that sleety December afternoon, was darning a tea-cloth in the lounge of her Beulah Valley Tavern 5 miles up the river from the fort. It wasn't, of course, a tavern. It was a super boarding house as regards its 12 guest bedrooms and a slightly too arty tea room in its dining facilities. Despite his long affection for Lorinda, Doremus was always annoyed by the Singhalese brass finger bowls, the North Carolina table mats, and the Italian ashtrays displayed for sale on wobbly card tables in the dining room. But he had to admit that the tea was excellent, the scones light, the Stilton sound, Lorinda's private rum punches admirable, and that Lorinda herself was intelligent yet adorable, particularly when, as on this gray afternoon, she was bothered neither by other guests nor by the presence of that worm, her partner, Mr. Nipper, whose pleasing notion it was, because he had invested a few thousand in the tavern, he should have none of the work or responsibility and half of the profits. Doremus thrust his way in, patting off the snow, puffing to recover from the shakiness caused by skidding all the way from Fort Beulah. Lorinda nodded carelessly, dropped another stick on the fireplace, and went back to her darning with nothing more intimate than, "Hello, nasty out?" "Yah, fierce." But as they sat on either side the hearth, their eyes had no need of smiling for a bridge between them. Lorinda reflected, "Well, my darling, it's going to be pretty bad. I guess Windrip and Co. will put the women's struggle back into the 1600s with Anne Hutchinson and the Antinomians." "Sure, back to the kitchen. Even if you haven't got one. Any worse than us men notice that Windrip never mentioned free speech and the freedom of the press in his articles of faith? Oh, he'd have come out for them strong and hearty if he even thought of them." "That's so, T, darling?" "No, Lorinda, damn it, I feel like taking the family and sneaking off to Canada before I get nabbed, right after Buzz's inauguration." "No, you mustn't. We've got to keep all the newspaper men that'll go on fighting him and not go sniffing up to the garbage pail. Besides, what would I do without you?" For the first time, Lorinda sounded importunate. "You'll be a lot less suspect if I'm not around, but I guess you're right. I can't go till they've put the skids under me. Then I'll have to vanish. I'm too old to stand jail." "Not too old to make love, I hope. That would be hard on a girl." "Nobody ever is, except the kind that used to be too young to make love. Anyway, I'll stay for a while." He had, suddenly, from Lorinda, the resoluteness he had sought in church. He would go on trying to sweep back the ocean just for his own satisfaction. It meant, however, that his hermitage in the ivory tower was closed with slightly ludicrous speed. But he felt strong again and happy. His brooding was interrupted by Lorinda's curt, "How's Emma taking the political situation?" "Doesn't know there is one. He hears me croaking, and she heard Walt Trowbridge's warning on the radio last evening. Did you listen in? And she says, 'Oh my, how dreadful,' and then forgets all about it and worries about that saucepan that's got burnt. She's lucky. Well, she probably calms me down and keeps me from becoming a complete neurote. Probably that's why I'm so darned everlasting fond of her, and yet I'm chump enough to wish you and I were together, recognizingly together all the time, and could fit together to keep some little light burning in this coming new glacial epoch. I do, all the time, and I think that at this moment, all things considered, I should like to kiss you. Is that so unusual a celebration? Yes, always, always. It's the first time again. Look, Linda, do you ever stop to think how curious it is that with everything between us, like that night in the hotel in Montreal, we neither one of us seem to feel any guilt, embarrassment, can sit and gossip like this? No, dear, darling, it doesn't seem a bit curious. It was all so natural, so good. And yet, we're reasonably responsible people. Of course, that's why nobody suspects us, not even Emma. Thank God she doesn't, Doremus. I wouldn't hurt her for anything, not even for your kind-hearted favors. Beast! Oh, you might be suspected all by yourself. It's known that you sometimes drink liquor and play poker and tell hot ones, but who'd ever suspect the local female crank, the suffragist, the pacifist, the anti-censorshipist, the friend of Jane Addams and Mother Bloor could be a libertine? Highbrows, bloodless reformers. Oh, and I've known so many women agitators all dressed in Carry Nation hatchets and modest sheets of statistics that have been 10 times as passionate, intolerably impassionate, as any cream-faced, plump little kept wife in chiffon steppins. For a moment their embracing eyes were not merely friendly and accustomed and careless. He fretted, "Oh, I think of you all the time, and I want you, and yet I think of Emma too, and I don't even have the fine novelistic egotism of feeling guilty and intolerably caught in the complexities. Yes, it does all seem so natural, dear Linda." He stalked restlessly to the casement window, looking back at her every second step. It was dusk now, and the road smoking. He stared out inattentively, then very attentively indeed. "That's curious. Curiouser and curiouser. Standing back behind that big bush, lilac bush, I guess it is, across the road, there's a fellow watching this place. I can see him in the headlights whenever a car comes along, and I think it's my hired man, Oscar Ledoux, Shad." He started to draw the colorful red and white curtains. No, don't draw them. He'll get suspicious." "That's right. Funny it's watching here, if it is him. He's supposed to be at my house right now, looking at the furnace, Winters. He only works for me a couple hours a day, works in the sash factory the rest of the time, but he ought to. A little light blackmail, I suppose. Well, he can publish everything he saw today, wherever he wants to." "Only what he saw today?" "Anything, any day. I'm awfully proud, old dishrag like me, 20 years older than you, to be your lover." And he was proud. Yet all the while he was remembering the warning in red chalk that he had found on his front porch after the election. Before he had time to become very complicated about it, the door vociferously banged open, and his daughter Sissy sailed in. "Woot, woot, woot! Toodaloo! Good morning, Jeeves. Morning, Miss Lindy. How's all the folks on the old plantation everywhere I roam?" "Hello, Dad. No, it isn't cocktails, at least just one very small cocktail. It's youthful spirits." "My God, but it's cold. Tea, Linda, my good woman, tea." They had tea, a thoroughly domestic circle. "Race you home, Dad," said Sissy, when they were ready to go. "Yes. No, wait a second. Lorinda, lend me a flashlight." As he marched out the door, marched belligerently across the road, and Doremus seethed all the agitated anger he'd been concealing from Sissy, and, part hidden behind the bushes, leaning on his motorcycle, he did find Shad Ledoux. Shad was startled for once. He looked less contemptuously masterful than a Fifth Avenue traffic policeman as Doremus snapped, "What are you doing here?" And he stumbled in answering, I just, something happened to my motorbike." "So, you ought to be home tending the furnace, Shad." "Well, I guess I got my machine fixed now. I'll hike along." "No, my daughter is to drive me home, so you can put your motorcycle in the back of my car and drive it back." Somehow he had to talk privately to Sissy, though he was not in the least certain what it was he had to say. "Her? Rats! Sissy can't drive for sour apples. Crazy as a loon. Ledoux!" "Miss Sissy is a highly competent driver. At least she satisfies me. And if you really feel she doesn't quite satisfy your standard..." "Her driving don't make a damn bit of difference to me one way or the other. Good night." Recrossing the road, Doremus rebuked himself. That was childish me, trying to talk to him like a gent, but how I would enjoy murdering him. He informed Sissy at the door. Shad happened to come along, motorcycle in bad shape. Let him take my Chrysler. I'll drive with you. Fine. Only 6 boys have had their hair turned gray driving with me this week. And I meant to say, I think I'd better do the driving. It's a pretty slippery night tonight. Wouldn't that destroy you? Why, my dear idiot parent, I'm the best driver and you can't drive for sour apples. Crazy, that's all. Get in, I'm driving. Do you hear? Night, Lorinda. All right, dearest father, said Sissy with impishness which reduced his knees to feebleness. He assured himself, though, that this flip manner of Sissy, characteristic of even the provincial boys and girls who had been nursed on gasoline, was only an imitation of the nicer New York harlots and would not last more than another year or two. Perhaps this rattle-tongued generation needed a Buzz Windrip revolution in all its pain. Beautiful. I know it's well to drive carefully, but do you have to emulate the prudent snail? Said Sissy. Snails don't skid. No, they get run over, rather skid. So your father is a fossil. Oh, I wouldn't. Well, maybe he is, at that. There's advantages, anyway. I wonder if there isn't a lot of bunk about age being so cautious and conservative, and youth always being so adventurous and bold and original. Look at the young Nazis and how they enjoy beating up the communists. Look at almost any college class, the students disapproving of the instructor because he's iconoclastic and ridicules the sacred hometown ideas. Just this afternoon I was thinking, driving out here, listen, Dad, do you go to Lindy's often? Why? Why not? Not especially. Why? Why don't you? What are you two so scared of? You two are wild hair reformers. You and Lindy belong together. Why don't you, kind of be lovers? Good God almighty, Cecilia. I've never heard a decent girl talk that way in all my life. Just haven't you, dear. So sorry. Well, my lord, at least you've got to admit that it's slightly unusual for an apparently loyal daughter to suggest her father deceiving her mother, especially a fine, lovely mother like yours. Is it? Well, maybe. Usually to suggest it aloud, but I wonder if lots of young females don't sometimes kind of think it just the same when they see the venerable parent going stale. Sissy? Hey, watch that telephone pole. Hang it. I don't go anywhere near it. Now you look here, Sissy. You simply must not be so froward or forward, whichever it is. I always get those 2 words balled up. This is serious business. I've never heard of such a preposterous suggestion as Lorinda, and I being lovers. My dear child, you simply can't be flip about such final things as that. Oh, can't I? Oh, I'm sorry, Dad. I just mean about Mother Emma. Of course, I wouldn't have anybody hurt her, not even Lindy and you, but why, bless you, Venerable, she'd never even dream of such a thing. You could have your nice pie, and she'd never miss one single slice. Mother's mental grooves aren't they aren't so very sex-conditioned, if that's how you say it. More sort of along the line of a new vacuum cleaner complex, if you know what I mean. Page Freud. Oh, she's swell, but not so analytical and... Are those your ethics, then? Huh? Well, for cat's sake, why not? Have a swell time that'll get you full of beans again, and yet not hurt anybody's feelings. Why, say, that's an entire second chapter in my book on ethics. Sissy! Have you by any chance any vaguest notion of what you're talking about, or think you're talking about? Of course, and perhaps we ought to be ashamed of our cowardly negligence, but I don't suppose your mother, have taught you so very much about sex, and thank heaven you spared me the dear little flower and its simply shocking affair with that tough tomcat of a tiger lily in the next bed. Excuse me, I mean, in the next plot. I'm so glad you did. Pete's sake, I'd certainly hate to blush every time I looked at a garden. Sissy, child, please. You mustn't be so beastly cute. These are all weighty things. Penitently, I know, Dad. I'm sorry. It's just, if you only knew how wretched I feel when I see you so wretched and so quiet and everything. This horrible Windrip League of for God's sakers business has got you down, hasn't it? If you're going to fight 'em, you've got to get some pep back into you. You've got to take off the lace mitts and put on the brass knuckles. And I kind of have a hunch that Lorinda might do that for you. And only her. Huh, her pretending to be so high-minded. Remember that old wheeze Buck Titus used to love so? If you're saving the fallen woman, save me one. Oh, not so good. I guess we'll take that line right out of the sketch. But anyway, our Lindy has a pretty moist and hungry eye. Impossible, impossible. By the way, Sissy, what do you know about all this? Are you a virgin? Dad! Is that your idea of a question to... Oh, I guess I was asking for it. And the answer is yes, so far. But not promising one single thing about the future. Let me tell you right now, if conditions in this country do get as bad as you've been claiming they will, and Julian Falk is threatened with having to go to war, to prison, or some rotten thing like that, I'm most certainly not going to let any maidenly modesty interfere between me and him, and you might just as well be prepared for that. It is Julian, then, and not Malcolm? Oh, I think so. Malcolm gives me a pain in the neck. He's getting all ready to take his proper place as a colonel or something with Windrip's wooden soldiers, and I am so fond of Julian, even if he is the doggonest, most impractical soul, like his grandfather, or you. He's a sweet thing. We sat up purring pretty nothings till about 2 last night, I guess. Sissy! But you haven't... Oh, my little girl, Julian is probably decent enough. Not a bad sort, but you haven't let Julian take any familiarities with you. Dear, quaint old word, as if anything could be so awfully much more familiar than a good, capable 10,000 horsepower kiss. But darling, just so you don't worry, no, the few times late nights in our sitting room when I've slept with Julian, well, we've slept. I'm glad, but your apparent, probably only apparent information on a variety of delicate subjects slightly embarrasses me. Now you listen to me, and this is something you ought to be telling me, not me you, Mr. Jessup. Looks as if this country and most of the world, I am being serious now, Dad, plenty serious. God help us all. It looks as if we're headed right back into barbarism. It's war. There's not going to be much time for coyness and modesty any more than there is for a base hospital nurse when they bring in the wounded. Nice young ladies, they're out. It's Lorinda and me that you men are going to want to have around, isn't it? Isn't it? Now, isn't it? Maybe. Perhaps, Dreamus sighed, depressed at seeing a little more of his familiar world slide from under his feet as the flood rose. They were coming into the Jessup driveway. Shad Ledoux was just leaving the garage. Skip in the house, quick, will ya? Said Dreamus to his girl. Sure, but do be careful, hon. She no longer sounded like his daughter to be protected, adorned with pale blue ribbons, slyly laughed at when she tried to show off in grown-up ways. She was suddenly a dependable comrade, like Lorinda. Dreamus slipped resolutely out of his car and said calmly, Shad! Yeah? Did you take the car keys into the kitchen? Huh, no, I guess I left them in the car. I told you 100 times they belong inside. Yeah, well, how'd you like Miss Cecilia's driving? Have a good visit with old Mrs. Pike? He was derisive now, beyond concealment. Ledoux, I rather think you're fired, right now. Well, just feature that. Okay, Chief. I was just going to tell you that we're forming a second chapter of the League of Forgotten Men in the Fort, and I'm to be the secretary. They don't pay much, only about twice what you pay me. Pretty tight-fisted, but it'll mean something in politics. Good night. Afterward, Dreamus was sorry to remember that, for all his longshoreman clumsiness, Shad had learned a precise script in his red Vermont schoolhouse and enough mastery of figures so that probably he would be able to keep his rather bogus secretaryship. Too bad. When, as League Secretary a fortnight later, Shad wrote to him demanding a donation of $200 to the League, and Dreamus refused, the informer began to lose circulation within 24 hours. End of chapter 14. It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 15, by Sinclair Lewis. Usually I'm pretty mild. In fact, many of my friends are kind enough to call it folksy when I'm writing or speechifying. My ambition is to live by the side of the road and be a friend to man, but I hope that none of the gentlemen who have honored me with their enmity think for one single moment that when I run into a gross enough public evil or persistent enough detractor, I can't get up on my hind legs and make a sound like a two-tailed grizzly in April. So right at the start of this account of my 10-year fight with them as private citizen, state senator, and U.S. senator, let me say that the Sang Free River Light Power and Fuel Corporation are, and I invite a suit for libel, The meanest, lowest, cowardliest gang of yellow-livered, backslapping, hypocritical gun-toters, bomb-throwers, ballot stealers, ledger-fakers, givers of bribes, suborners of perjury, scab-hirers, and general low-down crooks, liars, and swindlers that ever tried to do an honest servant of the people out of an election. Not but what I have always succeeded in licking them, so that my indignation at these homicidal kleptomaniacs is not personal, but entirely on behalf of the general public. From 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. On Wednesday, January 6, 1937, just a fortnight before his inauguration, President-elect Windrip announced his appointments of cabinet members and of diplomats. Secretary of State, his former secretary and press agent Lee Saracen, who also took the position of High Marshal or Commander-in-Chief of the Minutemen, which organization was to be established permanently as an innocent marching club. Secretary of the Treasury, one Webster R. Skittle, president of the prosperous Fur and Hide National Bank of St. Louis. Mr. Skittle had once been indicted on a charge of defrauding the government on his income tax, but he had been acquitted more or less, and during the campaign he was said to have taken a convincing way of showing his faith in Buzz Windrip as the savior of the forgotten men. Secretary of War, Colonel Osceola Luthorn, formerly editor of the Topeka, Kansas Argus, and the Fancy Goods and Novelties Gazette, more recently high in real estate. His title came from his position on the honorary staff of the governor of Tennessee. He had long been a friend and fellow campaigner of Windrip. It was a universal regret that Bishop Paul Peter Prang should have refused the appointment as Secretary of War, with a letter in which he called Windrip "my dear friend and collaborator," and asserted that he had actually meant it when he had said he desired no office. Later, it was a similar regret when Father Coughlin refused the ambassadorship to Mexico, with no letter at all, but only a telegram cryptically stating, "just 6 months too late." A new cabinet position, that of Secretary of Education and Public Relations, was created. Not for months would Congress investigate the legality of such a creation, but meantime the new post was brilliantly held by Hector McGoblin, M.D., Ph.D., Honorary Lit D. Senator Porkwood graced the position of Attorney General, and all the other offices were acceptably filled by men who, though they had roundly supported Windrip's almost socialistic projects for the distribution of excessive fortunes, were yet known to be thoroughly sensible men and no fanatics. It was said, although Dreamus could never prove it, that Windrip learned from Lee Saracen the Spanish custom of getting rid of embarrassing friends and enemies by appointing them to posts abroad, preferably quite far abroad. Anyway, as ambassador to Brazil, Windrip appointed Herbert Hoover, who not very enthusiastically accepted it. As ambassador to Germany, Senator Borah. As governor of the Philippines, Senator Robert La Follette, who refused. And as ambassadors to the court of St. James, France, and Russia, none other than Upton Sinclair, Milo Reno, and Senator Bilbo of Mississippi. These three had a fine time. Mr. Sinclair pleased the British by taking so friendly an interest in their politics that he openly campaigned for the Independent Labour Party and issued a lively brochure called "I, Upton Sinclair, prove that Prime Minister Walter Elliot, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and First Lord of the Admiralty Nancy Astor are all liars and have refused to accept my freely offered advice." Mr. Sinclair also aroused considerable interest in British domestic circles by advocating an act of Parliament forbidding the wearing of evening clothes and all hunting of foxes except with shotguns. And on the occasion of his official reception at Buckingham Palace, he warmly invited King George and Queen Mary to come and live in California. Mr. Milo Reno, insurance salesman and former president of the National Farm Holiday Association, whom all the French royalists compared to his great predecessor Benjamin Franklin for forthrightness, became the greatest social favorite in international circles of Paris, the Basses Pyrenees, and the Riviera, and was once photographed playing tennis at Antibes with the Duc de Tropez, Lord Rothermere, and Dr. Rudolf Hess. Senator Bilbo had possibly the best time of all. Stalin asked his advice, as based on his ripe experience in the Gleichschaltung of Mississippi, about the cultural organization of somewhat backward natives of Tajikistan, and so valuable did it prove that Excellency Bilbo was invited to review the Moscow military celebration, the following November 7th in the same stand with the very highest class of representatives of the classless state. It was a triumph for His Excellency. Generalissimo Voroshilov fainted after 200,000 Soviet troops, 7,000 tanks, and 9,000 airplanes had passed by. Stalin had to be carried home after reviewing 317,000. But Ambassador Bilbo was there in the stand when the very last of the 626,000 soldiers had gone by, all of them saluting him under the quite erroneous impression that he was the Chinese ambassador. And he was still tirelessly returning their salutes, 14 to the minute, and softly singing with them the International. He was a less of a hit later, however, when the unsmiling Anglo-American Association of Exiles to the Soviet Russia from Imperialism, he sang to the tune of the International, what he regarded as amusing private words of his own. "Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, from Russia make your getaway, they are all rich in Bilbo's nation, God bless the USA." Mrs. Adelaide Tarr-Gimmich, after her spirited campaign for Mr. Winthrop, was publicly angry that she was offered no position higher than a post in the customs office in Nome, Alaska, though this was offered to her very urgently indeed. She had demanded that there be created, especially for her, the cabinet position of Secretariess of Domestic Science, Child Welfare, and Anti-Vice. She threatened to turn Jeffersonian, Republican, or Communistic, but in April she was heard of in Hollywood writing the scenario for a giant picture to be called They Did It in Greece. As an insult and boy-from-home joke, the president-elect appointed Franklin D. Roosevelt minister to Liberia. Mr. Roosevelt's opponents laughed very much, and opposition newspapers did cartoons of him sitting unhappily in a grass hut with a sign on which the NRA had been crossed out and USA substituted, but Mr. Roosevelt declined with so amiable a smile that the joke seemed rather to have slipped. The followers of President Winthrop trumpeted that it was significant that he should be the first president inaugurated not on March 4th, but on January 20th, according to the provision of the new 20th Amendment to the Constitution. It was a sign straight from heaven, though actually heaven had not been the author of the amendment, but Senator George W. Norris of Nebraska, and proved that Winthrop was starting a new paradise on earth. The inauguration was turbulent. President Roosevelt declined to be president. He politely suggested that he was about half ill unto death, but that same noon he was seen in a New York shop buying books on gardening and looking abnormally cheerful. More than 1,000 reporters, photographers, and radio men covered the inauguration. 27 constituents of Senator Porkwood, of all sexes, had to sleep on the floor of the senator's office, and a hall bedroom in the suburb of Bladensburg rented for $30 for 2 nights. The presidents of Brazil, the Argentine, and Chile flew to the inauguration in a Pan-American aeroplane, and Japan sent 700 students on a special train from Seattle. A motor company in Detroit had presented to Winthrop a limousine with armor plate, bulletproof glass, a hidden nickel-steel safe for papers, a concealed private bar, and upholstery made from the Toussaint tapestries of 1670. But Buzz chose to drive from his home to the Capitol in his old Hupmobile sedan, and his driver was a youngster from his hometown whose notion of uniform for state occasions was a blue serge suit, red tie, and derby hat. Winthrop himself did wear a topper, but he saw to it that Lee Saracen saw to it that the 130 million plain citizens learned by radio, even while the inaugural parade was going on, that he had borrowed the topper for this one sole occasion from a New York Republican representative who had ancestors. But following Winthrop was an un-Jacksonian escort of soldiers, the American Legion, and immensely grander than the others, the Minutemen, wearing trench helmets of polished silver and led by Colonel Dewey Hake in scarlet tunic and yellow riding breeches and helmet with golden plumes. Solemnly, for once looking a little odd, a little like a small-town boy on Broadway, Winthrop took the oath administered by the Chief Justice, who disliked him very much indeed, and edging even closer to the microphone, squawked, "My fellow citizens, as President of the United States of America, I want to inform you that the real New Deal has started right this minute, and we're all going to enjoy the manifold liberties to which our history entitles us, and have a whale of a good time doing it. I thank you." That was his first act as president. His second was to take up residence in the White House, where he sat down in the East Room in his stocking feet and shouted at Lee Saracen, "This is what I've been planning to do now for 6 years. I bet this is what Lincoln used to do. Now let him assassinate me." His third in his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Army was to order that the Minutemen be recognized as an unpaid but official auxiliary of the regular Army, subject only to their own officers, to Buzz and to High Marshal Saracen, and that rifles, bayonets, automatic pistols, and machine guns be instantly issued to them by government arsenals. That was at 4 p.m. Since 3 p.m., all over the country, bands of MMs had been sitting gloating over pistols and guns, twitching with desire to seize them. Fourth coup was a special message next morning to Congress, in session since January 4th, the 3rd having been a Sunday, demanding the instant passage of a bill embodying point 15 of his election platform, that he should have complete control of legislation and execution, and that the Supreme Court be rendered incapable of blocking anything that it might amuse him to do. By joint resolution, with less than half an hour of debate, both houses of Congress rejected that demand before 3 p.m. on January 21st. Before 6, the president had proclaimed that a state of martial law existed during the present crisis, and more than 100 congressmen had been arrested by Minutemen on direct orders from the president. The congressmen, who were hot-headed enough to resist, were cynically charged with inciting to riot. They who went quietly were not charged at all. It was blandly explained to the agitated press by Lee Saracen that these later quiet lads had been so threatened by irresponsible and seditious elements that they were merely being safeguarded. Saracen did not use the phrase protective arrest, which might have suggested things. To the veteran reporters, it was strange to see the titular Secretary of State, theoretically a person of such dignity and consequence that he could deal with the representatives of foreign powers, acting as a press agent and yes-man for even the president. There were riots instantly, all over Washington, all over America. The recalcitrant congressmen had been penned in the district jail. Toward it, in the winter evening, marched a mob that was noisily mutinous toward the Winthrop for whom so many of them had voted. Among the mob buzzed hundreds of Negroes armed with knives and old pistols, for one of the kidnapped congressmen was a Negro from Georgia, the first colored Georgian to hold high office since carpetbagger days. Surrounding the jail behind machine guns, the rebels found a few regulars, many police, and a horde of Minutemen, but at these last they jeered, calling them Minnie Mouses and tin soldiers and mama's boys. The MMs looked nervously at their officers and at the regulars who were making so professional a pretense of not being scared. The mob heaved bottles and dead fish. Half a dozen policemen with guns and nightsticks trying to push back the van of the mob were buried under a human surf and came up grotesquely battered and ununiformed, those who ever did come up again. There were 2 shots, and one Minuteman slumped to the jail steps, another stood ludicrously holding a wrist that spurted blood. The Minutemen, why, they said to themselves, they never meant to be soldiers anyway and just wanted to have some fun marching. They began to sneak into the edges of the mob, hiding their uniform caps. That instant, from a powerful loudspeaker in a lower window of the jail, brayed the voice of President Basilius Winthrop. "I'm addressing you, my own boys, the Minutemen, everywhere in America. To you and only you, I look for help to make America a proud, rich land again. You have been scorned. They thought you were the lower classes. They wouldn't give you jobs. They told you to sneak off like bums and get relief. They ordered you into lousy CCC camps. They said you were no good because you were poor. I tell you that you are, ever since yesterday noon, the highest lords of the land, the aristocracy, the makers of the new America of freedom and justice. Boys, I need you. Help me. Help me to help you. Stand fast. Anybody tries to block you, give the swine the point of your bayonet." A machine gunner, who had listened reverently, let loose. The mob began to drop, and into the backs of the wounded as they went staggering away, the infantry, running, poked their bayonets. Such a juicy squash it made, and the fugitives looked so amazed, so funny as they tumbled in grotesque heaps. The MMs hadn't, in dreary hours of bayonet drill, known this would be such a sport. They'd have more of it now, and hadn't the President of the United States himself told each of them personally that he needed their aid? When the remnants of Congress ventured to the Capitol, they found it seated with MMs, while a regiment of regulars under Major General Meineke paraded the grounds. The Speaker of the House and the Honorable Mr. Perley Beecroft, Vice President of the United States and presiding officer of the Senate, had the power to declare that quorums were present if a lot of members chose to dally in their district jail, enjoying themselves instead of attending Congress. Whose fault was that? Both houses passed a resolution declaring Point 15 temporarily in effect during the crisis. The legality of the passage was doubtful, but just who was to contest it, even though the members of the Supreme Court had not been placed under protective arrest, merely confined each to his own house by a squad of Minutemen. Bishop Paul Peter Prang had, his friends said afterward, been dismayed by Winthrop's stroke of state. Surely, he complained, Mr. Winthrop hadn't quite remembered to include Christian amity in the program he had taken from the League of Forgotten Men, though Mr. Prang had contentedly given up broadcasting ever since the victory of justice and fraternity in the person of Basilius Winthrop. He wanted to caution the public again, but when he had telephoned to his familiar station, WLFM in Chicago, the manager informed him that, just temporarily, all access to the air was forbidden, except as it was especially licensed by the offices of Lee Saracen. Oh, that was only one of the 16 jobs that Lee Saracen and his 600 new assistants had taken on in the past week. Rather timorously, Bishop Prang motored from his home in Parasopolis, Indiana, to Indianapolis Airport and took a night plane for Washington, to reprove, perhaps even playfully, to spank his naughty disciple Buzz. He had little trouble in being admitted to see the president. In fact, he was, the press feverishly reported, at the White House for 6 hours, though whether he was with the president all the time they could not discover. At 3 in the afternoon, Prang was seen to leave by a private entrance to the executive offices and take a taxi. They noted that he was pale and staggering. In front of his hotel, he was elbowed by a mob who, in curiously unmenacing and mechanical tones, yelped, "Lynch 'em! Down with the enemies of Winthrop!" A dozen MMs pierced the crowd and surrounded the bishop, and the ensign commanding them bellowed to the crowd so that they all might hear, "You cowards, leave the bishop alone! Bishop, come with us, and we'll see you're safe." Millions heard on their radios that evening the official announcement that, to ward off mysterious plotters, probably Bolsheviks, Bishop Prang had been safely shielded in the local district jail, and with it a personal statement from President Winthrop that he was filled with joy at having been able to rescue from the foul agitators my friend and mentor, Bishop P.P. Prang, than whom there is no man living who I so admire and respect. There was, as yet, no absolute censorship of the press, only a confused imprisonment of journalists who offended the government or local officers of the MMs, and the papers chronically opposed to Winthrop carried by no means flattering hints that Bishop Prang had rebuked the president and had been plain jailed, and with no response about a rescue. These mutters reached Parasopolis. Not all Parasipolitans ached with love for the bishop or considered him a modern St. Francis, gathering up the little fowls of the fields in his handsome LaSalle car. There were neighbors who hinted that he was a window-peeping snooper after bootleggers and obliging grass widows. But proud of him, their best advertisement, they certainly were, and the Parasopolis Chamber of Commerce had caused to be erected at the eastern gateway to Main Street the sign, "Home of Bishop Prang, radio's greatest star." So as one man, Parasopolis telegraphed to Washington demanding Prang's release, but a messenger in the executive offices, who was a Parasopolis boy, he was, it true, a colored man, but suddenly he became a favorite son, lovingly remembered by old schoolmates, tipped off the mayor that the telegrams were among hundredweight of messages that were daily hauled away from the White House unanswered. Then, a quarter of the citizenry of Parasopolis mounted a special train to march on Washington. It was one of those small incidents which the opposition press could use as a bomb under the Winthrop, and the train was accompanied by a score of high-ranking reporters from Chicago and later from Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and New York. While the train was on its way, and it was curious what delays and sidetrackings it encountered, a company of Minutemen at Logansport, Indiana, rebelled against having to arrest a group of Catholic nuns who were accused of having taught treasonably. High Marshal Saracen felt that there must be a lesson, early and impressive. A battalion of MMs sent from Chicago in fast trucks arrested the mutinous company and shot every third man. When the Persepolitans reached Washington, they were tearfully informed by a brigadier of MMs who met them at the Union Station that poor Bishop Prang had been so shocked by the treason of his fellow Indians that he had gone melancholy mad, and they had tragically been compelled to shut him up in St. Elizabeth's government insane asylum. No one willing to carry news about him ever saw Bishop Prang again. The brigadier brought greetings to the Persepolitans from the president himself and an invitation to stay at the Willard at government expense. Only a dozen accepted, the rest took the first train back, not amiably. And from then on, there was one town in America in which no MM ever dared to appear in his ducky forage cap and dark blue tunic. The chief of staff of the regular army had been deposed. In his place was Major General Emmanuel Kuhn. Doremus and his like were disappointed by General Kuhn's acceptance, for they had always been informed, even by the nation, that Emmanuel Kuhn, though a professional army officer who did enjoy a fight, preferred that the fight be on the side of the Lord, that he was generous, literate, just, and a man of honor, and honor was the one quality that Buzz Woodruff wasn't even expected to understand. Rumor said that Kuhn, as Nordic a Kentuckian as ever existed, a descendant of men who had fought beside Kit Carson and Commodore Perry, was particularly impatient with the puerility of anti-Semitism, and that nothing so pleased him as, when he heard new acquaintances being superior about the Jews, to snarl, "Did you by any chance happen to notice that my name is Emmanuel Kuhn, and that Kuhn might be a corruption of some name familiar on the east side of New York?" "Oh, well, I suppose even General Kuhn feels orders are orders," sighed Doremus. President Winthrop's first extended proclamation to the country was a pretty piece of literature and of tenderness. He explained that powerful and secret enemies of American principles, one rather gathered that they were a combination of Wall Street and Soviet Russia, upon discovering to their fury that he, Berzelius, was going to be president, had planned their last charge. Everything would be tranquil in a few months, but meantime there was a crisis during which the country must bear with him. He recalled the military dictatorship of Lincoln and Stanton during the Civil War, when civilian suspects were arrested without warrant. He hinted how delightful everything was going to be. Right away now, just a moment's patience, when he had things in hand. And he wound up with a comparison of the crisis to the urgency of a fireman rescuing a pretty girl from a conflagration and carrying her down a ladder for her own sake, whether she liked it or not, and no matter how appealingly she might kick her pretty ankles. The whole country laughed. "Great card, that Buzz, but mighty competent guy," said the electorate. "I should worry whether Bish Prang or any other nut is in the booby hatch, long as I get my $5,000 a year like Winthrop promised," said Shad Ledoux to Charlie Betts, the furniture man. It had all happened within the 8 days following Winthrop's inauguration. End of chapter 15. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, chapter 16. "I've no desire to be president. I would much rather do my humble best as a supporter of Bishop Prang, Ted Bilbo, Gene Talmadge, or any other broad-gauge but peppy liberal. My only longing is to serve." From 0 Hour by Berzelius Winthrop. Like many bachelors given to vigorous hunting and riding, Buck Titus was a fastidious housekeeper, and his mid-Victorian farmhouse fussily neat. It was also pleasantly bare. The living room, a monastic hall of heavy oak chairs, tables free of dainty covers, numerous and rather solemn books of history and exploration, with the conventional sets, and a tremendous fireplace of rough stone. And the ashtrays were solid pottery and pewter, able to cope with a whole evening of cigarette smoking. The whiskey stood honestly on the oak buffet, with siphons, and with cracked ice always ready in a thermos jug. It would, however, have been too much to expect Buck Titus not to have a red and black imitation English hunting print. This hermitage, always grateful to Doremus, was sanctuary now, and only with Buck could he adequately damn Winthrop and company, and people like Francis Tasbro, who in February was still saying, "Yes, things do look kind of hectic down there in Washington, but that's just because there's so many of these bull-headed politicians that still think they can buck Winthrop. Besides, anyway, things like that couldn't ever happen here in New England." And indeed, as Doremus went on his lawful occasions past the red brick Georgian houses, the slender spires of old white churches facing the green, as he heard the lazy irony of familiar greetings from his acquaintances, men as enduring as the Vermont hills, it seemed to him that the madness in the capital was alien and distant and unimportant as an earthquake in Tibet. Constantly, in The Informer, he criticized the government, but not too acidly. The hysteria can't last. Be patient and wait and see, he counseled his readers. It was not that he was afraid of the authorities. He simply did not believe that this comic tyranny could endure. It can't happen here, said even Doremus, even now. The one thing that most perplexed him was that there could be a dictator seemingly so different from the fervent Hitlers and gesticulating fascist and the Caesars with laurels round bald domes. A dictator with something of the earthy American sense of humor of a Mark Twain, a George Ade, a Will Rogers, and Artemus Ward. Winthrop could be ever so funny about solemn, jaw-drooping opponents and about the best method of training what he called a Siamese fleahound. Did that, puzzled Doremus, make him less or more dangerous? Then he remembered the most cruel mad of all the pirates, Sir Henry Morgan, who had thought it ever so funny to sew a victim up in wet rawhide and watch it shrink in the sun. From the perseverance with which they bickered, you could tell that Buck Titus and Lorinda were much fonder of each other than they would admit. Being a person who read little and therefore took what he did read seriously, Buck was distressed by the normally studious Lorinda's vacation liking for novels about distressed princesses, and when she airily insisted that they were better guides to conduct than Anthony Trollope or Thomas Hardy, Buck roared at her and in the feebleness of bated strength, nervously filled pipes and knocked them out against the stone mantel. But he approved of the relationship between Doremus and Lorinda, which only he, and Shad Ledoux, had guessed. And over Doremus, 10 years his senior, this shaggy-headed woodsman fussed like a thwarted spinster. To both Doremus and Lorinda, Buck's overgrown shack became their refuge, and they needed it late in February, 5 weeks or thereabouts after Winthrop's election. Despite strikes and riots all over the country, bloodily put down by the Minutemen, Winthrop's power in Washington was maintained. The most liberal 4 members of the Supreme Court resigned and were replaced by surprisingly unknown lawyers who called President Winthrop by his first name. A number of congressmen were still being protected in the district jail. Others had seen the blinding light forever shed by the goddess of reason and happily returned to the Capitol. The Minutemen were increasingly loyal. They were still unpaid volunteers, but provided with the expense accounts considerably larger than the pay of the regular troops. Never in American history had the adherents of a president been so well satisfied. They were not only appointed to whatever political jobs there were, but to ever so many that really were not. And with such annoyances as congressional investigations hushed, the official awarders of contracts were on the merriest of terms with all contractors. One veteran lobbyist for steel corporations complained that there was no more sport in his hunting. You were not only allowed, but expected to shoot all government purchasing agents sitting. None of the changes was so publicized as the presidential mandate abruptly ending the separate existence of the different states and dividing the whole country into 8 provinces. Thus, asserted Winthrop, economizing by reducing the number of governors and all other state officers, and, asserted Winthrop's enemies, better enabling him to concentrate his private army and hold the country. The new northeastern province included all of New York State, north of a line through Ossining, and all of New England except a strip of Connecticut shore as far east as New Haven. This was, Doremus admitted, a natural and homogeneous division, and even more natural seemed the urban and industrial metropolitan province, which included Greater New York, Westchester County up to Ossining, Long Island, the strip of Connecticut dependent on New York City, New Jersey, northern Delaware, and Pennsylvania as far as Reading and Scranton. Each province was divided into numbered districts, each district into lettered counties, each county into townships and cities, and only in these last did the old names, with their traditional appeal, remain to endanger President Winthrop by memories of honorable local history. And it was gossiped that next the government would change even the town names, that they were already thinking fondly of calling New York Brazilian and San Francisco San Saracen. Probably that gossip was false. The northeastern province's 6 districts were 1. Upper New York State, west of and including Syracuse; 2. New York, east of it; 3. Vermont and New Hampshire; 4. Maine; 5. Massachusetts; 6. Rhode Island and the unraped portion of Connecticut. District 3, Doremus Jessup's district, was divided into 4 counties of southern and northern Vermont and southern and northern New Hampshire, with Hanover for a capital. The district commissioner merely chased the Dartmouth students out and took over the college buildings for his offices, to the considerable approval of Amherst, Williams, and Yale. So Doremus was living now in Northeastern Province, District 3, County B, Township of Beulah, and over him for his administration and rejoicing were a provincial commissioner, a district commissioner, a county commissioner, an assistant county commissioner in charge of Beulah Township, and all their appertaining guards and emergency military judges. Citizens who had lived in any one state for more than 10 years seemed to resent more hotly the loss of that state's identity than they did the castration of the Congress and the Supreme Court of the United States. Indeed, they resented it almost as much as the fact that, while late January, February, and most of March went by, they were still not receiving their governmental gifts of $5,000, or perhaps it would be beautifully $10,000 apiece, had indeed received nothing more than cheery bulletins from Washington to the effect that the Capital Levy Board, or CLB, was holding sessions. Virginians, whose grandfathers had fought beside Lee, shouted that they'd be damned if they'd give up the hallowed state name and form just one arbitrary section of an administrative unit containing 11 southern states. San Franciscans, who had considered the Los Angelinos even worse than the denizens of Miami, now wailed with agony when California was sundered and the northern portion lumped in with Oregon, Nevada, and others as the Mountain and Pacific province, while Southern California was, without her permission, assigned to the southwestern province along with Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Hawaii. As some hint of Buzz Windrip's vision for the future, it was interesting to read that this southwestern province was also to be permitted to claim all portions of Mexico which the United States may from time to time find it necessary to take over, as a protection against the notorious treachery of Mexico and the Jewish plots there hatched. Lee Saracen is even more generous than Hitler and Alfred Rosenberg in protecting the future of other countries, sighed Doremus. As provincial commissioner in the northeastern province comprising Upper New York State and New England was appointed Colonel Dewey Hake, that soldier, lawyer, politician, aviator, who was the chilliest-blooded and most arrogant of all the satellites of Windrip, yet had so captivated miners and fishermen during the campaign. He was a strong flying eagle who liked his meat bloody. As district commissioner of District 3, Vermont and New Hampshire appeared, to Doremus' mingled derision and fury, none other than John Sullivan Reek, the stuffiest of stuffed shirts, that most gaseous gas bag, that most amenable machine politician of northern New England, a Republican ex-governor who had, in the alembic of Windrip's patriotism, rosely turned leaguer. No one had ever troubled to be obsequious to Honorable J.S. Reek, even when he had been governor. The weediest backcountry representative had called him Johnny in the gubernatorial mansion, 12 rooms and a leaky roof, and the youngest reporter had bawled, "Well, what bull you handing out today, X?" It was this Commissioner Reek who summoned all the editors in the district to meet him at his new vice-regal lodge in Dartmouth Library and receive the precious privileged information as to how President Windrip and his subordinate commissioners admired the gentleman of the press. Before he left for the press conference in Hanover, Doremus received from Sissy a poem, at least she called it that, which Buck Titus, Lorinda Pike, Julian Falk, and she had painfully composed late at night in Buck's fortified manor house. Be meek with Reek, go fake with Hake. One rhymes with sneak, the other with snake. Hake with his beak, he's on the make, but Sullivan, Reek, oh God. Well, anyway, Windrip's put everybody to work, and he's driven all these unsightly billboards off the highway. It's much better for the tourist trade, said all the old editors, even those who wondered if the president wasn't perhaps the least bit arbitrary. As he drove to Hanover, Doremus saw hundreds of huge billboards by the road, but they bore only Windrip propaganda, and underneath, with the compliments of a loyal firm, and a very large Montgomery cigarettes or jonquil foot soap. On the short walk from a parking space to the former Dartmouth campus, three several men muttered to him, "Give us a nickel for a cup of coffee, boss. A Minnie Mouse has got my job, and the Mouses won't take me. They say I'm too old. But that may have been propaganda from Moscow." On the long porch of the Hanover Inn, officers of the Minutemen were reclining in deck chairs, their spurred boots. In all the MM organization there was no cavalry. Up on the railing. Doremus passed a science building in front of which was a pile of broken laboratory glassware, and in one stripped laboratory he could see a small squad of MMs drilling. District Commissioner John Sullivan Reek affectionately received the editors in a classroom, old men used to being revered as prophets, sitting anxiously in trifling chairs facing a fat man in the uniform of an MM commander who smoked an unmilitary cigar as his pulpy hand waved greeting. Reek took not more than an hour to relate what would have taken the most intelligent men 5 or 6 hours, that is, 5 minutes of speech and the rest of the 5 hours to recover from the nausea caused by having to utter such shameless rot. President Windrip, Secretary of State Saracen, Provincial Commissioner Hake, and himself, John Sullivan Reek, they were all being misrepresented by the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, the Communists, England, the Nazis, and probably the jute and herring industries. And what the government wanted was for any reporter to call on any member of this administration, and especially on Commissioner Reek, at any time, except perhaps between 3 and 7 a.m., and get the real lowdown. Excellency Reek announced then, and now, gentlemen, I am giving myself the privilege of introducing to all 4 of the counter-commissioners who were just chosen yesterday. Probably each of you will know personally the commissioner from your own county, but I wanted you to intimately and cooperatively know all 4 because, whoever they may be, they join with me in my unquenchable admiration of the press. The 4 county commissioners, as one by one they shambled into the room and were introduced, seemed to Doremus an oddish lot. A moth-eaten lawyer known more for his quotations from Shakespeare and Robert W. Service than for his shrewdness before a jury. He was luminously bald except for a prickle of faded rusty hair, but you felt that if he had his rights he would have the floating locks of a tragedian of 1890, a battling clergyman famous for raiding roadhouses, a rather shy workman, an authentic proletarian who seemed surprised to find himself there. He was replaced a month later by a popular osteopath with an interest in politics and vegetarianism. The 4th dignitary to come in and affectionately bow to the editors, a bulky man, formidable-looking in his uniform as a battalion leader of the Minutemen, introduced as the commissioner for the northern Vermont, Doremus Jessup's county, was Mr. Oscar Ledoux, formerly known as Shad. Mr. Reek called him Captain Ledoux. Doremus remembered that Shad's only military service, prior to Windrop's election, had been as an AEF private who had never got beyond a training camp in America and whose fiercest experience in battle had been licking a corporal when in liquor. "Mr. Jessup," bubbled the Honorable Mr. Reek, "I imagine you must have met Captain Ledoux. Comes from your charming city." Said Doremus. "Sure," said Captain Ledoux. "I met old Jessup all right. He don't know what it's all about. He don't know the first thing about economics of our social revolution. He's a chauvinist. But he ain't such a bad old coot, and I'll let him ride as long as he behaves himself." "Splendid," said the Honorable Mr. Reek. End of chapter 16.